Welcome to the Mobile Application Framework YouTube channel. My name is Frank Impjes and I'm from the Oracle Application Development Tools and Mobility Tools Product Management team. In this episode, I will talk about MAF binding layer programming. So that's the Java access to the binding layer to read, write or manipulate state on the binding layer. And I will give you reasoning why you want to do this. So first, let's have a look at the overall architecture just to set the context of where this talk here belongs to. So you see the architecture that goes from the user interface through the binding layer to the data control and then ending up to whatever data service you want to access. It's a remote service or maybe a local SQLite database access. Now the bit that we're talking here about is just this little binding layer. So we talk to the binding layer, and the binding layer, as you learned in a previous episode, is referenced from the page through the data binding CPX file in a page definition file. Yeah, so this is what we call the binding layer. At design time, it's purely metadata. At runtime, it's all Java, and we're dealing here with the Java objects. Now, the use cases include to programmatically set or get information that is displayed on the user interface. Now, one reason for that would be that, say, the user enters some data, and based on this you can aggregate further information. Even though the user could type them in, you can compute that for them. Example would be like in a travel expense report, I specify the overall amount I spend in a hotel and give the number of nights, and you break it down to what the cost is per day. Of course I could type it in, but if you can compute it out of the information you have, then your application should do that. And for this, you would use access to the binding layer. Another option is to set a row currency, like to help people navigating through a collection of information by just setting the row currency on an iterator. And of course, you want to work with a consistent set of APIs, which means the minimum amount of skills that you would need just to perform all the actions on the client side that you need. Now, the binding layer, it's consistent, so independent of the page that you're on, if you work through the binding layer, the APIs you work with are always the same, and that is what I call and refer to as consistent, and that makes a lot of your productivity. So what can you access in the MAF binding layer? Well, I list all of these here. So you see, for instance, the binding container, and the binding container is up there. I can access to the attribute binding or the value binding. These are mapped to individual input and output text components. I can access a tree binding, which typically is referenced from a graph, from an iterator, or from a list view. I have list bindings, which are used with a select one choice component. And I do have method and operation bindings to invoke custom methods or operations that are exposed, for instance, for SOAP services on the framework. And I do have variables and parameters I want to access. Parameters, for instance, will be used if I drag and drop a method from the data control panel onto a page and create a parameter form. Then all of these information I fill in before submitting the method will be saved in a parameter. So these are what I'm covering in the next slides. So first of all, there are different options for you to access this information. One option is to get a hole onto the binding container and then do everything in Java. Just call get or get method binding, whatever you want to access in the binding container purely through Java. And the other option is just to use expression language in Java, which is not a bad thing to do because it would allow you to straight point to the piece of information you want. So instead of navigating through the binding layer, then to the attribute value binding, and then to its input value, I could just have this expression language resolved in Java and go straight to the input value or set the input value. For this, we provide helper, of course. It's a framework, so the framework should provide help, and there's a class ADFM Java Utilities, and this utility class has methods like evaluate expression language, get the ADF expression language context, get value expression, or get method expression. Now this would allow you to resolve expression languages in Java. And then once you have these resolved, you either work with the data or with a reference. For instance, the method expression reference will give you a method expression that you then can invoke from your Java core. So let's have a look first at the binding layer. Now, the binding layer is representing the current page definition instance. I covered that in a previous episode, but the page definition file is what at design time you use to create all the UI component bindings, the data bindings for a UI component on a page. At runtime, this is turned into a Java container, and the Java container is the binding container. So to access the binding container, actually, what you do is you can use expression language, so use the hash and then in curly braces bindings. It always references the current binding container that you're looking at. Once I have access to the bindings, I can go further now and can say, okay, I'm interested in an attribute value like department name. So I can now say the bindings get and then the ID of that binding, which I can get from the page definition file, and then I can cast this into an attribute binding, and in the next step, for instance, I could call get input value or set input value. So that would be one way of getting to this. The next is to talk about value bindings in general. Now value bindings, and here you see the name example I had on the previous slide. Now value bindings are mapped to single instances of a component like input text field, output text field. And that will allow you to set or read values. A very nice trick, by the way, if you're working with iterators, like you have an iterator in a list view, and for the selected list view item, you want to get an attribute that's also available in the iterator but not displayed on the list view. One way of doing that would be to create an attribute value binding in the binding layer, and then after the selection of the new row in the list view, just get access to that attribute value binding, because the attribute value binding is always synchronized with the current state of the iterator. So it always gives me a window into the specific attribute of the current row. So just a use case. There are different ways to get there, but that's the most easiest way to do that. So that's the attribute value binding. So how do I get to this attribute value binding? So one option is to just go straight for the attribute binding, just by bindings.name. So here you see I still use bindings as the first argument in my expression language call, and that is because this references the binding container. And then I can, on this attribute binding, I can call set input value and set the name to Stephen King, which will automatically update the user interface if I do this from Java. And that has to do with property change events that are internally raised. And then I can of course read the value from that attribute. Another option is to call IDFM Java utils set expression language value, because if I just want to set a value or read a value, I don't need to go through all of the parsing of the binding infrastructure. I can go straight and say, okay, I know I want to set a value expression. So in this case, the value expression is name, and I know the name object has an attribute called input value, and I can call it straight. The tree binding, I mentioned, this is bound to list views, iterators, graphs, and that also gives you access to the underlying iterator that it reads the data from. To get access to the tree binding, similar to what I've showed before, there's an AMX tree binding object representing that binding at runtime. So I can access this through IDFM Java utils and again evaluate expression language expression, and here again I just give the ID identifier of the entry, of the tree entry in my page definition file to this code, and I get the instead of the tree binding, can work with that. The list binding, surprise, surprise, there's a little bit of a change between MAF and ADF, just in case that you're coming from an ADF background, and that is that the list binding actually internally binds to an attribute binding. So the class that it references is AMX attribute binding, and it passes a parameter, and this parameter tells the class if it's a static attribute or if it's a static list or if it's a dynamic list. And based on that, we get a different internal structure back that allows us to work with that. So here, no surprise, we do have an attribute binding that we use, and on this attribute binding we could call get input value, or we can even try to get access to the list items. Again, depends pretty much on the setting, on the configuration and the use of this attribute binding. Now if you create a list, select one choice, then internally that flag is set and the attribute binding will behave differently. Methods and operations, not much difference here between those of who know ADF and MAF, though MAF is a completely different product, so don't try and mix the two. There are different classes involved here. So what we do with that is we access an operation which typically is a framework operation that accesses local sources like an iterator. So if you have a create operation exposed on a SOAP iterator, then that will change the data locally in this iterator but not on the remote service. Typically, to invoke something on the remote service, you call a method. Anyway, both use AMX method action binding as the class. Now this would allow me to programmatically invoke a method and also to programmatically populate the values. So here I have an AMX method action binding, and you see I'm passing 2 arguments and 2 values to that method, and then I execute it, and that would call then the remote service or just the POJO data control if I use that. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that with methods there are different ways of populating the arguments. Whenever you drag and drop an operation or a method that requires an argument, then in the page definition file we create an item under the name of the method. And this allows you to put in expression language to reference a user interface component or, for instance, a managed bean or just a memory attribute. So in this case, you don't necessarily have to pass in the argument in your Java code. You can just go straight and execute it. However, if purely the information that you need to provide is different from what you can access from a managed bean, then you can pass this information in Java as well, as shown here on the slide. And then there is the iterator binding. Now the iterator binding is a collection holder, a collection of data holders, so to say. So whenever there's a tree binding referenced by a list view component or by an iterator, then that's a reference to a collection of objects. Now this collection of objects on the first access doesn't really give you the real thing. It gives you an instead of AMX iterator binding. This is a wrapper around another iterator which is internal and called basic iterator, still a public class and good to use. So you want to go to the basic iterator because the basic iterator gives you access to the current row index, to the data provider of the current row, just to deal with that. However, how do you access this? So example 1, and I have 2 of these, is just to call basic iterator on an expression that evaluates the binding, and then the iterator name, in my name is custom iterator.iterator. So here I resolve the full access path to the basic iterator in my expression language. In the end, I'll deal with basic iterator. So what you need to take away really from this part of the episode is that basic iterator is the iterator you want to work with. Now and then I can do whatever I want. I can call get current row on the iterator and I will get the current row representation, and I can call get data provider to get either generic type for the SOAP service or the entity I'm working with if it's a POJO data control. The second approach is that we call bindings custom iterator, and that is what we cast then to AMX iterator binding. And on the AMX iterator binding, if it's not null, we can call get iterator. Now that's exactly the same as the expression language would do, just we do it in Java here. Yeah, so 2 ways to get to the same result, get access to the iterator, and that would allow you to set it. You see, for instance, here in this code slide, I highlighted the case where I'm dealing with SOAP services, and when I'm dealing with SOAP services, then the data provider, actually the current row that I'm dealing with, that's of type generic type. Otherwise, it's the entity that you get from the POJO data control. Parameters, well, parameters can be accessed. There is an iterator type called variable, and I can get access to an iterator by just referring variable. However, is that really needed? No. And why? Because if I use a variable which is kind of mapped as a parameter to an input form, then it also creates an attribute value binding. So there's no need basically for me to go over all of the variables, and the variable iterator is just one iterator with, I don't know, 1 to 100,000 attributes. Depends on how many variables you have. Now, instead of parsing this and trying to figure out which belongs to which form, I use the attribute value binding. And the attribute value binding, if I code get input value, will just get that information from the variable for me. So just a hint of better coding and easier coding in IDF. Now, how do you learn about these binding classes, and how did I get to all of these classes? Are there books? No. So the recommendation here is really make the debugger your source of inspiration. And debugging, especially if you're on a Mac, if you're working on iOS, it makes it very easy to debug into it. And there is an episode on debugging as well where we explain debugging. But the way that the debugger works is that on Android and on iOS, you can run an application in the resources category of the resource panel. There's a CVM properties file, and there you can set the debug options to true. Now when you run the application, even if you deploy it to a device, if that is set up for debugging, then the application, once started, will wait for you to start the debugging process. So on the view controller project, right mouse click, debugging, and you run the debugger, and then every breakpoint that you set in your application will be called as users will, or you probably by testing, navigate through it. And that allows you to step through it. And that's, I'm not saying that this is how you should learn the framework, but for advanced users, usually you're more interested in advance what's really going on, what's part of a collection or what part of a response. Trial and error is a way to get you somewhere, but the time it takes to be there is just a waste of time. So you want to go straight to the point. And beside of all the product documentation, collateral, and this episode that we recorded, the debugger is a good friend of yours. Now, in this session, I gave you a full run over the binding objects and how to access them from Java, mostly through expression language, as we look for an easy way of accessing things. Now it's up to you to find what's the best implementation for your use case. Don't go for coding only because you're a coder. Go for the easiest and simplified and straightforward way of accessing information. If that is declarative and purely visual, hey, go for that. If, however, you have a need for programmatic access to the binding layer and to the data control, which I presented in a previous episode, then go for the Java approach. You see, and that's the bottom line message of this episode, the binding and the data control and MAF in general, it's a framework. It's a Java framework, HTML, JavaScript framework, all of these combinations. And you use whatever you find useful for the use case that you're after.